Hey Phil, welcome to Bring Your Own Bold. How are you doing today?
Good to be with you. Very well, thank you.
Good stuff. Listen, you and I have spoken quite a lot over the past few months. Obviously, we have a great deal in common, even though we work in slightly different fields. The one thing that struck me from our conversations is I'm really, really taken with the variety of businesses you work with and senior leaders within those businesses. So I'm super excited to dive into this conversation with you today. And I guess just for a bit of context for those watching, one of the reasons we were really keen to put this session on is we at Shape by deal with, speak with, have clients in senior leadership positions within quite large tech businesses, mainly on the B2B side, mainly working in the marketing, creative and brand fields. And I know there will be a lot of you out there watching who are in those positions, and especially leadership positions, as I say. And a lot of the conversations that we have with folks, particularly in those teams, maybe slightly even leaning more towards the creative teams, I would say, is the perception of their team internally, and sometimes, or even often, the need to change that perception from being kind of seen as, I suppose, slightly more kind of order takers. In some cases, I've heard things referred to as the colouring in department even. You know, we need this, can you give us this? To real strategic partners within the organisation. Those teams especially have so much to offer when they're seen as strategic partners and treated like strategic partners. We've got a couple more sessions within Bring Your Own Bold that address this from different angles. But I'm super excited to dive into this with you because you've got so much experience of changing perceptions within teams like that. So let's get into it. So let's say you're a leader who wants to change the perception of your team internally. Why is it so important to, first of all, begin by actually looking at how your own team works together?
Well, I think really simply how a team works together predicts how a team will work with other people, right? So fundamentally, a team that is incoherent, that isn't clear on what it's trying to achieve, where conflict, we'll talk about this maybe later on, isn't sufficiently well managed within that team, where there isn't a kind of a sense of where we're all trying to get to. It's very, very hard for a team like that to actually go out and engage with the wider organization in any sort of sensible or coherent fashion. Really well-run teams tend to be able to then move as one in organizations to be able to bring about change. So, and also I think there's a broader point for leaders as well, which is if your team feels well run within a business, I think you're also building credibility with colleagues, and people look at a team and go, oh yeah, it feels like they know what they're doing. You know, it feels like they know what they're doing. It feels like they're on the march, you know. So that kind of stuff I think is really, really helpful. So we've got to start by looking within, I think, a lot of the time. And you mentioned that thing about going from kind of order takers to strategic partners. Well, first of all, the job is make sure that the team is in a position to be able to do that, right? And that means there's sort of 5 conditions that need to be met in that team. There's 5 steps really from a leadership standpoint, which are going to help you get the team into that position. We can talk through those if it's helpful now, Dave. But yeah, it is really important to make sure there's that kind of coherency within and without.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you approach this very much from a framework point of view. And I know there's a particular framework that you're quite keen to talk about that really kind of helps teams to embed this in place. Let's hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's again, doing what I do, you know, as a coach and consultant, there's any number of tools and frameworks that you pull upon, but this one feels quite helpful because it applies in almost any situation, almost any type of business, and any particularly marketing team that's struggling to get that sense of internal coherence would do well to look at these things. So it's called the 5 steps to team vitality. And effectively what it says is there are 5 conditions, ideally sequentially, that a leader needs to make sure are met within teams in order to be able to bring the best out of those teams. Those conditions are, and you'll see it coming up on screen in a second, I understand, comprehension, confidence, engagement, endurance, and reflection. So to talk through those briefly, Comprehension is all about, we know why this team exists and the individuals in it are clear about their own role and the role of the team as a whole in bringing about that vision, in effect. So that's what comprehension is about. If we then move on to confidence, it's about individual team members having the sense of belief in the people around them that collectively we've got what we need in terms of skills, experience, mindset, knowledge, whatever, in order to be able to get to where we need to go. Rapport is part of that as well. Do I feel a sense of kind of camaraderie with my colleagues? Engagement then is about getting the work done. So actually, are we able to collaborate effectively in order to be able to solve the often difficult problems that we're facing as a group of people? That might be problems about how we engage with a wider organization. Again, we can come on to that in a bit. Endurance is about the fact that actually in any kind of process of change, one of my favorite sayings is an old Haitian proverb: behind the mountains, more mountains, right? And basically what that points to is the fact that the work is really never done, right? So at any change processes, everything will take longer than you think. It's quite arduous, and it will take time for change to manifest. So actually, how do you help teams to feel resourced for that journey? So endurance is about people feel as though they've got what they need, sometimes actually in quite hard practical terms, sometimes in emotional support terms, whatever else, in order to be able to stay the course. And then reflection is about, do we actually have the time to look back at what we're doing, to learn from the experiences that we're having, and to some sense upcycle those for future use? Now, that all sounds perhaps almost hysterically basic, until you start looking at actually how a lot of teams get managed in businesses. So, for example, 3 of the most common issues I see in when we start talking about this kind of thing. Firstly, comprehension. There's a reason why it's like step 1. And actually, I would say in a lot of teams that I go into, coach and consult with, comprehension isn't there in the way that it needs to be. So this was brought to life brilliantly by an example recently where I was working with a big media organization. We had 160 of their leaders in a room talking about how they were going to work together to deliver the strategy. That was the theme of this day. So 160 people doing it. One of the strategic pillars was exploit the digital opportunity. And we're in breakout groups. And I walked past one of the breakout tables and I heard a leader say, the problem we've got here is I'm not clear on what we mean by digital, and I'm not clear on what we mean by opportunity. Right now, at this point in time, this particular group of people had struggled for 12 months to make strategic progress in their organization. And so they were working on what you might call the engagement layer of the kind of 5 steps, the engagement step, but they actually hadn't done the comprehension job properly. Another problem is that leaders can be really, really good at ignoring that second step, which is confidence, building rapport, getting that sense of teams knowing what they need to do. Again, if you go into scale-up organizations, for example, it's not uncommon that what happens is people start being recruited very, very quickly. And suddenly they're required to work with people. They don't really know what their role is. They don't know much about these people as individuals. They don't really feel a sense of connection with them. And so actually it becomes very, very hard to know how to navigate together within a team to that kind of better future. And then the final example I'll give you is the point about reflection. Almost to a business that I've worked with over the last sort of, I dread to say it, but 20, 25 years. Plus, I've now been doing work. I used to be a marketeer as well, by the way. So I know all this I've seen all this from both sides of the table as well. Teams are routinely bad at taking time for reflection. So there's this kind of overt bias towards action in business all the time, actually. That means we very rarely kind of stop to learn. And again, if you don't take time to reflect, well, actually, you're not really learning the lessons. Actually, weirdly, go back to the start, comprehension can suffer and confidence can suffer because there's no reflection. There's no sense of actually learning from experience in all of this. But actually, at the same time, like that endurance piece will really start to drop off as well. And it's really hard to carve out the time for that in a lot of organizations, but it's absolutely essential in terms of energy management and also bringing the best out of teams. So, sorry, I've gone on there a bit, but that's the kind of sense of how it needs to work. And I think get those things right, and then you're in a position to start going out to the wider organization, start to have a conversation about what needs to be different in the working relationships there, you know?
I love it. Really, really love it. It makes so much sense. And I know that you mentioned in there that, it can feel a little bit almost hysterically basic, but obviously, clearly it's not. I just wondered, are there any points at which you can say that a particular stage in that framework has been completed? Do they overlap, for instance? Is it a case of saying, right, we've done comprehension, let's move on to confidence? And how can you measure and track those things to make sure that not only are they kind of there or thereabouts, you've kind of achieved them, but they stay done, they stay achieved, they stay in focus?
Well, behind the mountains, more mountains, right? So the work is never done. Any work about how a team works together, what you might call culture of a team or of an organization, it's constantly in flux, constantly in development. What I would say is, if you're starting something, or if we're just trying to get going, new team, new project, whatever it is not a bad thing to try and think about how you would get some baseline conditions in place sequentially, which is why they're steps, right? So ultimately, comprehension has to happen first, right? You cannot hope to have a team which is confident in one another, engaged in solving a problem, willing to endure the course to get there, and able to reflect on what it's learned if it's not clear on what it's there to do in the first place, right? So there is nothing wrong in just sort of, starting with those 5 steps and working through them sequentially and thinking through what are the baseline conditions I will need to create here in each of those, for each of those things to be possible. Beyond that, what I would say is constant vigilance across all 5, right? So a really easy one to talk about in this sort of context, Dave, is comprehension. I cannot tell you the number of times that you go into teams or I'd say I go into teams, and what happens is, you find yourself having conversations with leaders which are effectively as follows. Well, I gave them that PowerPoint presentation back in February, right? And we're now in August. And they've not revisited that in any way, shape, or form since then. My lesson for leaders is this: around the time that you're sick of saying it is usually around the time it starts to go in, right? We're all busy, we're all distracted, we've got mortgages, we've got kids, we've got, challenging relatives, we've got Trump, whatever's going on that's distracting us geopolitically or whatever economically, as well as in our own day-to-day lives. People are really busy, really overloaded. And even though this stuff matters to them because it's their work, our ability to retain information is not perhaps always what we would want or need it to be, right? So repeat. And of course, I will talk about this a bit later on when we talk about the job of actually genuinely building the perception of being a strategic partner in an organization. Understanding that as context changes as well, there might be a need to revisit communication, might be a need to revisit comprehension and make sure that it's still intact. Yeah. So I would say sort of vigilance around points like that's really important. If we go up the 5 steps, and we'll just talk about endurance for a second as well, right? So if we think about endurance is the kind of thing that's really easy to talk about in the abstract and incredibly hard to do in practice, which you will know if you've ever run a marathon, right? So everyone talks about endurance sports. Well, I've run marathons and, there is no feeling like 19 miles. Do you know what I mean? And that's where endurance kind of really matters. So the interesting thing about that is we get into a conversation which is about the emotional labor of leadership. Right? How are we checking in with our people about how they're feeling? When endurance really counts is usually when, frankly, we're up against it in some way, shape, or form. There might be internal dynamics that are really challenging. We might be having pressure from sales teams around delivering something. If you're trying to fundamentally change the perception of the organization, the marketing organization, that is, you're going to be saying no sometimes to things you might have said yes to historically. Well, that's going to potentially mean there's some real challenge coming the way of your team members, for example. And so understanding that then the job of leadership is to be checking in on that and checking in on how we all actually doing with the realpolitik and the realities, I guess, in a broader sense of what it is we're facing, that becomes really, really important. And then that's where reflection also really helps you as well, by the way, because actually time, pause, learn from this and move forward can be genuinely helpful too. So I think work through the steps sequentially, but it's constant vigilance around them as well. And the world is not as simple as you just do 5 things and it gets solved. It's there is a job to do to keep coming back to these things over and over again. But I would say where I am seeing teams who are not performing as well as they might, or as well as leaders would like them to, usually there is something missing, or more than one thing missing in some of these 5 steps.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Such good advice. And one thing that kind of binds all of this stuff together, both in terms of the way that teams work together and also other teams work with each other cross-functionally, is this word that crops up time and time again for good reason: collaboration. Collaboration is so important in everything that we do in our working lives, but especially so given that a lot of the people watching this will be working remotely. So won't be in office environments with their team, won't be side by side looking into the whites of their eyes when they're trying to get great work done. What are some of the common challenges in your experience that come with effective collaboration when you work with the clients that you work with?
It's such an interesting word, collaboration, isn't it? Because it sort of gets used constantly, and yet actually true collaboration, like really effective collaboration, is rarer than perhaps one would like it to be a lot of the time. Brilliantly, a few years ago, a CMO who we were then working with said, the thing about collaboration is everybody thinks it's easy until they try to do it. And I thought this was kind of excellent, and we'll talk about why that is. So collaboration. So again, if we're thinking about that shift, I want to keep bringing it back to the shift you talked about, Dave. Which is from order takers to strategic partners. Well, what that mandates is a much more elevated form of collaboration across a business, right? Ultimately, you're going to have to be working with people as partners to help them solve complex problems, which means there needs to be a contribution coming from a marketing team which is genuinely collaborative, right? Now, that brings us to some very, very interesting themes about what actual genuine collaboration requires. One of the themes, and we'll get on talking about second framework in a second, but I want to just foreground one of the themes. One of them is conflict. Right. So all collaboration requires conflict in the same way that all creativity requires dissent. Right. Ultimately, you cannot be creative if you're not prepared to disagree in some sense, right, or challenge something in some sense. Like creativity always requires that. Cultures that have no tolerance for dissent tend not to be terribly creative or innovative. Collaboration requires us to be able to manage conflict. Now, again, I could talk about this for hours, but there is an absolute truth of organizational life, which is you don't have a choice about whether or not you have conflict in an organization. You only have a choice about whether or not it is healthy or unhealthy in how you manage it. Now, where there are 2 or more people together, there is always going to be conflict. Right. And the reason that there's going to be conflict is simply to do with how we're constituted as human beings. So you, Dave, as a human being, you have your genetics, your neurology, you have the life experience that you've had and you continue to have to this day, which feeds you a whole load of data, which has then been influenced by the way that you've been brought up, the environment that you're now in, the people that you're in contact with all day, every day, your media diet, and a whole load of other stuff that we don't have time to get into this morning, right? I am the same, but my data is different. So fundamentally, the way I see the world and the way that you see the world, they can never be the same. It's the joy of human beings as well, right? Like all of us are irreplaceable. Richard Dawkins on Weaving the Rainbow, there is a one, we are born to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. It's like literally there's a 1 in a trillion chance of you ever being born in the first place, right? So none of us see the world in the same way, right? So for that reason, as soon as we come to try and do something together, your data and my data are going to be in some fundamental sense in conflict, right? So how do we reconcile that? Now, effective collaboration is fundamentally about, can we resolve our disagreements quickly and in ways that are additive to the greater good, right? So quickly in and of itself doesn't necessarily always help us, but actually if we think about both as quickly as possible, which may actually be quite slowly, and also in ways that contribute to the greater good, then that becomes the definition, as it were, of effective collaboration. Now, most of us are really not good at this, right? So we're not brought up in an environment that teaches us about collaboration, or teaches us about conflict, sorry. So schools don't teach us about effective conflict, and workplaces don't teach us about effective conflict. And actually, a lot of the incentives in workplaces, which are geared around hierarchy, around social acceptability, around psychological safety, all of that sort of stuff. And there's nothing wrong with it, but what it can do is it can make conflict really difficult to embrace. So if we're going to have a conversation about collaboration, we need to have a conversation about how we're going to disagree with each other. And for a lot of people who've been used to being order taking, right at the heart of the order taking mentality, I suppose, if you want to call it that, I don't mean that judgmentally, is the fact that we're not going to disagree. We're just going to say yes, and then we're going to make it happen. And now we need to start saying no, and that's going to be a new sort of set of skills we need to learn around all of that. So I think that's the most common challenge, but we can start to get into that in a little bit more detail, I think.
Yeah, I'd love to. I was hanging on your every word there, Phil. Honestly, it's so true. And, when someone's, talking about this stuff, you inevitably start thinking about examples from your own experience, and instantly think about ways to improve. So I feel like I'm learning so much already from this session. I know that you mentioned about another framework, introducing another framework. There are two frameworks that we want to talk about in this session, and we've already spoken about one of them. We're not going to overload you too much with frameworks, although I would urge you to get in touch with Phil if you ever want to learn more about these. But pleased to introduce the regeneration equation to our audience.
Yeah, and the regeneration equation came out really from a question around collective energy. Ultimately, it was around how is it that when teams are feeling like they are lagging energy in some sense, or they are really struggling to kind of work out how to build themselves toward a breakthrough moment. What is it that actually needs to be in place? This is a really challenging framework. So this is the literal opposite. If the 5-step stuff looks almost, as I say, comically basic, although, as you rightly point out, Dave, in execution, it can be anything but. This is a much higher order leadership challenge, I would argue. And again, it should be on screen now, but just to say, really what the framework does, if you come up and out of just the words that are on screen for a second, what it's really saying is there is hard emotional labor to do as a leader to create the conditions in which your people can have necessary conversations with you, with each other, and with the wider business. That's fundamentally what it's saying, right? And uncomfortable conversations, the zone of uncomfortable conversations, I would say every effective leader I've worked with, or every effective leader that kind of comes out of a coaching program with me, will have enhanced conflict capabilities, right? Fundamentally, the ability to step into the zone of uncomfortable conversations and to hold it in that space is really one of the differentiators of effective leadership. And it's one of the conditions of effective leadership, in my view. So, one of the things I've had to work hard at over the years as an individual who is quite shy, if you knew me outside of work, and ultimately very, very agreeable in big 5 personality terms, is I've had to get good at uncomfortable conversations, because basically my work, I mean, fundamentally it is my work. So I now have an almost comically high tolerance for sort of high stress situations at work, because I'm just so used to being in them with the leaders that I'm working with. But it is a skill, and you have to practice it, right? So fundamentally, what this framework talks about is that there are effectively 3 things that we need to get good at. So the first is context. So again, back to the point I was making earlier on about comprehension. Context is really about acknowledging why we are where we are today in every situation that we're in. So if you, as a marketing leader, are trying to have a conversation with a sales leader or an operational leader or anybody else in your business about what needs to be different, there needs to be an acceptance and an acknowledgement that things have not been working well in the past or in the present, right? Or that things can be improved in some sense in the past and in the present. There needs to be that working kind of honesty of dialogue really about what's gone on. And also a kind of working understanding as well of not only why things need to be different in the context of what the organization is experiencing, but different as well in the context of what's going on in, say, the wider marketplace, the wider world, right? So that scanning the environment piece is really, really important. Acknowledging history, the number of times that I go into organizations and the real barriers to things like effective communication and collaboration are to do with the fact that people are still feeling quite hurt by something that happened back in the day. That's a colossal issue, right? And so to be able to kind of name things that maybe need addressing in the context of what we now need to be different also becomes really important. And then finally, that point about speaking the uncomfortable truth, can actually we move into a place where we are acknowledging that something needs to change? There may be pain that comes with that thing needing to change as well. And how do we navigate through that? Again, this kind of slightly narcissistic Panglossian view of, everything's going to be great all the time that you see going in a lot of internal comms is actually the enemy of effective change. Sometimes having the direct and honest and uncomfortable conversation is the right thing to do. So this is not easy. I'm not pretending this is easy. And then we move into communication and conflict. And I'll just say, if you look at it's an equation, not because there's a kind of formula for doing this stuff right, but it helps to arrange concepts in a way that means we can make some degree of sense of them. Context tends to be the magnifier on the other two things. So what I mean by that is, if we have context collapse, in other words, if we've not actually clearly understood context, or indeed our understanding is out of date, or we're not doing a good enough job in the interactions that we've got with other people about explaining context and all the rest of it, then actually we're in a world where the other two things get wholly diluted, right? So communication in the end is about the creation of dialogue. Now, if you're trying to shift from being an order taker to being a strategic partner, it is all about quality of conversation. Like, at the end of the day, I'm a strategic partner to my clients. I mean, good luck in getting me to take an order. But I want to work with my clients in a way which fundamentally is quite generative. So together we can get somewhere that we would otherwise struggle to get to independently, right? Don't believe I've got all the answers. Don't believe I'm right most of the time. What I do believe is I've got a contribution to make. And the way I make the contribution is through dialogue. And again, that's what we need to be inculcating in our teams as well. Inviting their contribution, inviting the contribution of others. And what I mean by that, really, in the context of being a strategic partner, is perhaps reaching out of marketing and helping other people to shape that role. If marketing isn't working as well as it might in a business, it stands to reason that other people in the business will be seeing that in some way, shape, or form. They may not have the depth of analysis that you have around it, but they will be seeing it or the consequences of it. And secondly, also, they will be perhaps interested or invested in some sense in it being better. So that's a great basis to create dialogue, but also invite contribution from others. And then finally, actually just making sure that you give it time. Like, all communication, all conversation takes time. Conflict takes time as well. I always say you can be efficient with everything but people. If you don't believe that's true, try and have an efficient row with your significant other, So it's just, really, really important to understand this. This will feel like inefficient work, but actually in the fullness of time, it gets you so much further. And then we've talked about conflict a little bit already in this conversation, so I don't want to kind of, go back over old ground here. But just to say, if you're trying to move to order taker to strategic partner, those conversations, there is going to be there is going to be disagreement and debate around what needs to be done. Marketing is going to have to step into a much greater sense of authority about what works and what doesn't. That can be really discomforting. Don't forget that we're all highly status conscious creatures. You're actually moving up in status if you want to become a strategic partner, which is potentially going to be threatening other people and their role in the business as well. So there's going to be discomfort that kind of comes from all of that stuff too. And it's about actually, how do we manage and navigate through that? Which a lot of the time is really about empathy as much as anything else. It's about, again, just trying to understand, Dave, that when I'm in conversation with you, we see the world differently. But if I can try and do a job of understanding how you see the world, which is where the dialogue thing comes in again, then actually we might be able to move forward really, really well. When we worked with a global marketing team for a few years, I say we because it was in my big corporate practice that we did this. they had been really struggling to change along this kind of dimension that we're talking about here. And, they'd had this big change sort of strategy up and running for years and years and years, and they'd been pushing adjectives around on paper about how they were going to behave differently and all the rest of it. And we just came in and really taught them how to disagree with each other. And we really taught them how to hold an uncomfortable space with the rest of the business in terms of the conversations that they were having there, and actually how to learn to listen, which is really integral to all of that. They sorted the rest of the change out for themselves, and it became the most successful transformation progress that organization had done in 20 years. It won awards for business transformation, and all we did was teach them how to have an argument effectively. I mean, that was the long and the short of it. Not that that's what the award entry said, but that's a different matter.
Absolutely, fair enough. And I think one thing, as you were speaking there, and you alluded to this a little bit as you were talking, but I guess, so going back to the original point that we first started talking about, you're a leader who has started to implement these frameworks within your team first and foremost. Let's say you've gone through the 5 steps to team vitality, and then either alongside that or subsequent to that, you've introduced the regeneration equation and things are going pretty swimmingly. You really feel like everybody's on the same page. Collaboration is starting to become a little bit more seamless. You have disagreements, which, as you've mentioned, is a good thing ultimately, but all for the greater good. But it's one thing for leaders to do that within their own teams because they've really got the authority to do that. But do you have any advice for those who might be in a position now to say, well, actually, if we're going to be seen as strategic partners, I need to start instigating this cross-functionally. How do I go about doing that?
Well, again, I mean, I would actually go back to fundamentally, is there comprehension of what it is you're trying to do, what your agenda is, firstly, across your peers at, director level, exec level, head of level, whatever it is, right? Like fundamentally, there's got to be some sense collectively across the business of what it is you're trying to achieve. And that itself might mandate some quite difficult conversations. But that discussion around the need for a shift in role needs to be grounded in a really good quality analysis of why effectively and what it will require and what it might require of others and what the requests of others are as well, So again, trying to kind of, it's not necessarily always about building consensus, but it can at least around building understanding of what you're trying to achieve and the basis on which you're trying to achieve it. That feels really important. There's choices I think leaders make in all of this as well. Sometimes the best thing to do, we did this actually with the example I was giving you before, is we kind of went into almost like a sort of skunk works mode for 3 months, first of all. So actually we were like, quit doing this big visible change stuff. Let's just get one team of people working differently elsewhere within the business. So let's just get one team of people working differently with the rest of the business. So what we actually did was we took a small group of people and we gave them a project, and it was a marketing project. And we said, look, you need to work with sales a little bit differently on this. And we sort of gave them coaching, consulting, and training support around the dimensions I was talking about before, really around conflict and communication, all of that, to help them do that. Now, what was interesting about that was, it sort of took the pressure off, so that the leader didn't have to go and then give a kind of like, right, another reset in our change program, 76 trombones kind of thing. He just had to kind of, like manage a little bit of internal tension around it all. But it also did 2 other things. The first thing was, it gave a huge amount of data. So that team in those first 3 months, making that shift, order takers to strategic partners, really challenged some of what sales wanted doing and how it was to be done. They smashed internal benchmarks on performance by 500 to 800%, right? Wow. Literally by having a more uncomfortable conversation. We were gobsmacked. We were literally gobsmacked, to be honest. But they did it for a really smart group of people, by the way, brilliant group of people, but 500 to 800%. Now, suddenly that makes a whole set of conversations really a lot easier across the business at that point in time, because you can start going, well, you can stick with what's working, or we can have a 500% improvement. What would you like, right? But also what it then creates is belief in the team of people who are actually doing that work, that positive change is possible. Right. So suddenly we're in a world where actually we've got this pilot program. We've suddenly got data we can take to the rest of the business to build a different case to the business. And we've suddenly got a team of people that's believing it's possible. By the way, what then happened, just to finish the story, is that they went, great, this is going to work. So let's just scale it everywhere, everything everywhere all at once. So we were like, no. Good film, terrible strategy. Right. So it's like, classic, right? We just need to kind of do this across the whole European function. And it's like, well, no, that's not going to work. So we had to be quite canny with them about how it was all scaled. But do you see what I mean? So I would say start with comprehension, but you can think cannily sometimes about how visible, when visible, and actually what the kind of change model is that you plug into this as well, and how you build data, how you build belief in teams, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get the impatience in a sense. If you're starting to see success with something, there's always that temptation to say, right, let's just ladder it up. Let's do it here, there, and everywhere. But as we know, and as you've already mentioned, behind every mountain are other mountains. I probably butchered that phrase, but fair enough. How long does it really take, if you do this right? How long does it take before true change kind of starts to take effect if it's managed properly within a business?
Depends on the size of organization, depends on the specific nature of change, and it depends on what you mean by takes effect, which is just like the least helpful answer, but there is truth in it, right? What I would say is both quicker than you might think and slower than you might think. So what I mean by that is this: when you start to teach people about working together differently, right, and what that actually requires of them, and you start to build that consensus at the senior end about why and what this might look like in practice and all of that, when people start to have insight, the wonderful thing about advice is quite cheap. I'm really not in the advice game, right? Like, it's not interesting to me. Insight's much more valuable. The reason that insight's valuable is because when you've had an insight, you can't ignore it. You may choose to push it away, to not do anything with it, to whatever, but fundamentally it stays there. You've understood something, you've seen something. And insight is what precipitates change, not advice, right? So fundamentally, and when you start seeing groups of people having insights, then really change starts to take root quite quickly. Now, but then I would say slower than you would think as well, because actually, ultimately, we're talking about systems of work here. So we're often talking about not only human behavior, but we're talking about supporting, structures and processes in organizations, the way cultures need to evolve, all of that kind of stuff. Changing anything involves getting some stuff wrong. We haven't really had the time to talk about that, but we could go on for hours with all this stuff. And it just takes time for that to take root, particularly if you take the model as well that we were talking about earlier on, which is start small and scale from there. That can also take time to take root. But what you will see, so you will see that there are leading indicators, people starting to feel good about stuff. You'll see some quick strategic gains, but actually systemic change can take, in my experience, maybe somewhere between 6 months and in really large organizations, 3 years, which always sounds like a really long time to people. But actually, as I'm very fond of saying to clients, it's taken you half a decade to get yourselves into this mess. It's going to take you less than hard. No, it could take you, saying it's going to take you a couple of years to get out of it is not unreasonable, really, if you kind of think of it in those sorts of terms. And it sounds a bit facetious, but there is actually some truth in that, I think. And the other thing I would say is the real joy of it is that if I start saying 2 years, what's so wonderful about the kind of skills we're talking about here, I'm not talking about advice about how to run a project better, talking about how do people collaborate, how do they lead themselves and others. The most rewarding thing is, and I know when my work is done with organizations, because I kind of can slip out of the room almost unnoticed, because actually fundamentally they will continue to do change for themselves, to themselves, if that makes sense. And they've learned something, and there's kind of like a embodied knowledge in the organization, an embodied set of skills in the organization. And that's the stuff that takes a bit longer to build, but it's, my God, it pays back over years and years and years.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, it's new and it's uncomfortable. Then it becomes a habit. Then it becomes a mindset. And before you know it, it's second nature, I guess. Listen, Phil, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining me on Bring Your Own Bold today and sharing so many pearls of wisdom with us. If you guys are interested in checking out more of Bring Your Own Bold, there's plenty more content to choose from on today's drop. So please do get yourself involved in that. All that remains for me to say is thank you so much again, Phil. And if you guys enjoy the rest of Bring Your Own Bold, please do shout about it on socials. We would really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Take care.